My dad left me for his new family, but in the end, I was the only one who stayed. He sent me away, replaced me with his new wife and her golden boys, and barely looked back. But when he got sick, they vanished, no calls, no visits, nothing. I held his hand in the end, and when the will was read, his real family was left with nothing. I never really knew my mother. She died the day I was born. Complications, they said. My father, Theo, was just 24 when he lost her. And just like that, he became a single parent overnight. Most men in their early 20s are out partying, chasing careers, and figuring out their lives. But not my dad. He chose me. Every step of the way, he put his personal life on hold to raise me. And it wasn't easy. See, my dad wasn't just any regular guy, he was a movie producer. That meant long hours, constant travel, and an industry full of people who never really understood the concept of family. Despite his demanding career, he did everything he could to make sure I had a happy childhood. For almost 10 years it was just the two of us. No stepmothers, no siblings, just a father and daughter against the world. He got plenty of attention from women, of course. Being young, wealthy, and successful made him a target for every socialite and aspiring actress in the industry. But he never remarried, never even entertained the idea. Instead, he poured everything into raising me. Every school play, every birthday, every scraped knee, he was there. But as I got older, I started to notice something. No matter how much love he gave me, his work kept pulling him away. The late-night calls, the sudden trips, the last-minute script rewrites. It all meant he was gone more than he was home. And then, when I was 12, everything changed. When I was younger, we lived in a quiet coastal town. It was peaceful, safe, far from the noise of Hollywood. But as my dad's career grew, he moved us to a bigger city, closer to the heart of the film industry. I hated it immediately. The kids at my new school were different. They cared about brands, money, and social status, things that had never mattered to me before. My dad, not knowing any better, dressed me in simple clothes, more functional than fashionable. To him, it was just a normal way to live. But to the kids at my school, it was an invitation to bully me. There were two boys in particular, James and Jake. They were relentless. They made fun of my clothes, my quiet nature, even my dad's job. They called me names, humiliated me in front of other kids, and pushed me around. I tried to ignore it, but it only got worse. One day they took it too far. It happened in the hallway between classes. They were laughing, shoving each other when one of them accidentally bumped into me. The next thing I knew, I was tumbling down the stairs, my knee slamming into the cold tile floor. I still remember the pain, but what hurt more was the laughter. That was the day my dad got called to the school. When the principal explained what happened, my dad was furious. But his schedule was packed, and instead of meeting the bullies or their parents, he had to rush back to set. That was the first time I felt the distance between us. It wasn't his fault, not really. He tried his best, but in his world, time was a luxury he couldn't always afford. After that incident, he made a tough decision, one that changed everything. He sent me to live with my grandparents. First, I was devastated. Felt like he was choosing his career over me. But in hindsight, I know it was his way of protecting me. My grandparents were wonderful, kind, supportive, and always there when I needed them. With them I was safe. For the next 6 years, I rarely saw my dad. He visited for holidays, birthdays, and big family events, but most of the time he was just a voice on the phone. And slowly, without even realizing it, I started feeling like I didn't really know him anymore. By the time I was 15, I was settled into life with my grandparents. I had my own routines, my own dreams, and I had started making plans for the future. Then one night I overheard my grandparents whispering. At first I didn't think much of it, but something in their voices felt off. I caught bits and pieces. Married? Didn't tell her. Coming here tomorrow. I froze. I immediately confronted them, demanding to know what was going on. That's when they told me the truth. My dad had gotten married. I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. After all these years, after everything, he had gone and started a whole new family without even telling me. Her name was Lisa. I remember waiting on the couch, arms crossed, when they arrived the next day. The moment Lisa walked into the house, I knew something was off. She was too nice. That forced, sugary sweet kind of nice that felt like an act. She smiled too much, spoke too softly, and kept holding my hand like we were best friends. Felt fake. And I wasn't the only one who thought so. My grandparents exchanged uneasy glances the whole time. Then came the biggest shock of all. Lisa had kids. 2 boys. And when I finally saw them standing in the doorway, my stomach dropped. It was James and Jake. The same 2 boys who bullied me in middle school. The same ones who made my life hell. I couldn't believe it. I felt like I was in some kind of twisted nightmare. I looked at my dad, waiting for some kind of explanation, but he just smiled and said, "These are your stepbrothers now." I wanted to scream. After that day, something inside me changed. I wasn't just angry at my dad, I was hurt. It wasn't just that he had remarried or that he had kept it a secret. It was the fact that he had welcomed the same 2 boys who had tormented me into our family without a second thought. And now suddenly they were supposed to be my brothers? I could barely sit through the awkward conversation that followed. Lisa kept making small talk, acting like we were some happy, blended family. My dad asked if I wanted to come live with them now that I was old enough, but I refused on the spot. He looked surprised, almost hurt, but I didn't care. As far as I was concerned, he had made his choice and I had already made mine. When they left, I told my grandparents everything. They weren't shocked, not really. They had already gotten a bad feeling about Lisa, and now that I had met her, I understood why. Something about her felt off, like she was always calculating her next move. But at the end of the day, none of us could change what had already happened. My dad had remarried, and I had to accept it, even if I didn't like it. So I stayed with my grandparents, finished high school, and did my best to move on. Over the years, my relationship with my father grew more and more distant. He called, of course, but the calls felt forced, like he was checking something off a list. We saw each other on holidays, but even then it was different. He still cared, I knew that much, but it wasn't the same. It felt like he had his own life now, one that didn't include me the way it used to. I told myself I didn't need him. My grandparents had become my real family, and that was enough. Meanwhile, Lisa and her kids were living the good life. My dad was a successful producer, and that meant money, lots of it. From what my grandparents heard, Lisa had fully embraced the role of a wealthy Hollywood wife, spending my dad's money like it was hers. She wasn't interested in him as a husband, just as a provider. And James and Jake? They had no problem taking advantage of it. Expensive clothes, private coaches, luxury vacations, if they wanted it, my dad paid for it. But they never treated him like a real father. They made it clear that they weren't his kids, just kids he happened to be responsible for. And Lisa never did anything to stop it. My dad was trying though. He wanted to be part of their lives, to build some kind of relationship with them, but they weren't interested. To them, he was nothing more than an ATM. And the worst part? He let it happen. He bent over backward to make them happy, but it was never enough. And Lisa? She just let them walk all over him. By the time I was finishing high school, I had barely spoken to my dad in years. I didn't even know if I wanted to. I had already accepted that I wasn't part of his new life, and I figured that was that. But then something changed. I had always dreamed of going to film school, following in my dad's footsteps, not because I wanted to be like him, but because I genuinely loved the industry. I had worked hard, and when the acceptance letters came in, I had my pick of schools. But the best one? The one I really wanted to go to? It was in the same city where my dad and his new family lived. I knew what that meant. If I went, I'd have to see them again. I'd have to deal with Lisa, with James and Jake, and with the life my dad had built without me. I didn't know if I was ready for that. But my grandparents convinced me to go. They told me not to let my dad's choices keep me from chasing my dreams. So I made up my mind. I was going, but on my terms. I called my dad, told him I had been accepted, and made it clear that if I moved to the city, I didn't want him or Lisa interfering in my life. No checking up on me, no family dinners, no forced bonding. I was going for me, not for them. He agreed. But I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. Moving back to the city felt like stepping into a past I had spent years trying to forget. I had my own place now, a small dorm near campus, far enough from my dad's house that I wouldn't have to run into him unless I wanted to. And honestly, I didn't. I was here for film school to build my own career, and I had every intention of keeping my distance from his new family. But of course, things never go the way you plan. The moment my dad heard I was back, he was thrilled. He invited me over for dinner almost immediately. At first, I said no. I had no interest in playing happy family with Lisa and her kids. But after weeks of him asking and my grandparents gently reminding me that he was still my father, I gave in. I figured one dinner wouldn't kill me. The night I arrived at the house, it was obvious I was stepping into their home, not mine. The walls were covered in photos of Lisa and her sons with only a few of my dad. It was like I had never been part of his life at all. Lisa greeted me with that same overly sweet, fake warmth I remembered from years ago, acting like she was thrilled to see me. My dad looked thinner than I remembered, a little more tired, and it wasn't long before I realized why. James and Jake walked in just as I was about to leave, and the moment I saw them, everything clicked. I don't know why I hadn't realized it sooner. Maybe I had buried those memories so deep that I couldn't connect the dots. But standing in front of me were the same two boys who bullied me in middle school. The ones who pushed me down the stairs, who made my life hell, who laughed at me while I cried. And now they were my stepbrothers. I froze. For a moment, I wasn't a 24-year-old film student. I was 12 again, humiliated, angry, and helpless. They didn't recognize me at first, but when I said my name, I saw it click in their eyes. And just like that, their smiles faded. I wanted to tell my dad everything. I wanted to scream at him, ask him how he could have married their mother, how he could have let them into his home while he had sent me away. But I didn't. Because I already knew the answer. My dad didn't know. He had never been around enough to see what had happened back then. And even if he had known, what could he do? He was too wrapped up in his career in Lisa and making everyone happy except me. I left as soon as I could, ignoring Lisa's protests that I should stay for dessert. I called my grandparents that night, furious, and told them what I had just realized. They were quiet for a long time before finally saying what I already knew: it wasn't worth it. Telling my dad wouldn't change anything. Lisa had her hooks in him, and nothing I said would make a difference now. But I wasn't just angry at my dad anymore. The more time I spent in the city, the more I heard about what was really going on inside that house. My dad was really trying to connect with Lisa's kids, but they didn't care about him at all. He paid for their expensive acting classes, pulled strings to get them opportunities in the industry, and bent over backward to make them feel like they were part of the family. And how did they repay him? By treating him like an outsider in his own home. They openly mocked him in front of relatives, told people he wasn't their real dad, and only spoke to him when they wanted something. And Lisa? She did nothing. She just watched, completely unbothered, while her sons disrespected the man who was paying for their entire lives. It was disgusting. I didn't feel bad about staying away from my dad's house after that. I focused on school, on my own future. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. My dad was getting older, weaker, and for the first time, I started to wonder if he was okay. And then I got a phone call that changed everything. I was in the middle of a film project when my phone rang. It was my dad. He rarely called, and when he did, it was usually just to check in briefly before he got pulled away by something more important. But this time, his voice was different, weak, strained. He told me he had been feeling unwell for a while and had finally gone to the doctor. Then he said the words that made my stomach drop: "It's cancer. Stage 4. It had spread too far. There was no real treatment option left." I don't remember much of what he said after that. I just sat there, gripping my phone, feeling like my whole body had gone numb. I barely managed to ask the only question that mattered: "How much time do you have?" A few years at best, but the doctors weren't sure. Maybe less if things got worse quickly. For the first time in years, I didn't care about our past, about Lisa, about anything except the fact that my dad was dying. I started visiting him at the hospital, expecting to see Lisa by his side, maybe James and Jake too. But the truth hit me harder than I ever could have imagined. Lisa barely showed up. She came once in a while, dressed up like she was going to a brunch instead of visiting her sick husband. She spent most of her time scrolling through her phone, answering calls, stepping out when she got bored. She didn't sit with him, didn't comfort him, didn't even pretend to care. The moment it became clear that my dad wasn't going to beat this, she started checking out emotionally. As for James and Jake, they didn't even pretend to care. My dad had paid for everything: their schooling, their coaching, their lavish lifestyle, and yet, when he needed them most, they were nowhere to be found. They never visited unless Lisa forced them, and even then it was obvious they were just waiting for him to die so they could move on with their lives. The man who had given them everything was now nothing more than an inconvenience to them. But my dad still tried. He still wanted to be their father. Even as he lay there, losing weight, growing weaker by the day, he tried to talk to them, to ask about their lives, to offer advice for their careers. And every single time, they brushed him off, answering in the shortest way possible before going back to their phones or making an excuse to leave. He never said it out loud, but I could see the pain in his eyes. He knew. He knew they never saw him as a father. He knew they were just waiting for him to go so they could collect whatever they thought they were owed. And Lisa? She didn't even try to hide it. One night, when I was sitting by his bed, he told me something that made me want to scream. Lisa told him she didn't want to waste time waiting for someone who was about to become the past. Those were her exact words. She had already checked out of the marriage. My dad was dying, and the woman he had built a life with, the one he had sacrificed so much for, had already moved on in her mind. I was the only one left. The daughter he had sent away, the daughter he had unintentionally abandoned, the daughter he had chosen work over for years. I was the one sitting by his side, holding his hand, listening when he needed to talk, making sure he wasn't alone in his last days. And as much as it hurt to see him like that, I stayed. I was there. Even after everything. The night before he passed, he broke down. He apologized for everything, for sending me away, for not being there the way he should have been, for letting Lisa and her kids push me out of his life. He told me he loved me, that he had always loved me, that if he could go back and do things differently, he would. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there holding his frail hand, listening to the only words I had ever wanted to hear from him. I told him I loved him too, and for the first time in years, I felt like I really meant it. He died the next morning. Lisa showed up at the hospital just long enough to put on a sad face in front of other people. She stayed for about 15 minutes. James and Jake didn't even come. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't care. I had spent years resenting my father, feeling like I had lost him long before he got sick. But sitting there in that hospital room, watching the way his own wife and stepchildren treated him, I realized the truth. He had been alone for a long time. I was the only real family he had left. And in the end, when it really mattered, I was the one who stayed. A week after my dad's funeral, I got a call from his lawyer. He told me my father's will was going to be read at his house, and I needed to be there. I knew Lisa would be there too, along with James and Jake, and the thought of sitting in a room with them made my skin crawl. But I also knew my dad had left something for me, maybe an apology, maybe nothing at all, but I needed to hear it for myself. When I arrived at the house, Lisa was already there, sitting on the couch with her sons, looking impatient. Her usual fake warmth was gone. She wasn't playing nice anymore. She looked like a woman who had already decided what she was owed. The lawyer, a calm, serious man in his 60s, wasted no time. He opened the file, adjusted his glasses, and started reading. My father had left 70% of his entire estate to me. His house, his savings, his assets, almost everything he had built over the years was now legally mine. 20% went to my grandparents, who didn't even need it but would now be even more financially secure. The final 10% went to Lisa and her sons, along with a condo in the city. That was it. For the first few seconds, there was silence. Then Lisa's face twisted in rage. "This has to be a mistake," she snapped, sitting forward. "There's no way Theo would do this to me." The lawyer, completely unfazed, adjusted his glasses again. "It's not a mistake. Your husband made these decisions personally. His final wishes were clear." Lisa's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to find the right words to manipulate her way out of this, but nothing came. James and Jake were just sitting there, stunned. They had been expecting a huge payday, and now they realized they had basically been cut off. I watched their faces shift from confusion to anger. Lisa turned to me, her eyes burning. "You did this. You manipulated him. You turned him against us." I didn't say anything at first. I just stared at her, letting her words hang in the air. Then finally, I smiled, the same fake, sweet smile she had given me all those years ago. "I guess Dad just wanted to look at the future, not the past." Lisa's face went pale. She knew exactly what I was doing, giving her a taste of her own medicine. She stormed out of the house, dragging her sons with her. But I knew this wasn't over. Lisa wasn't the type to walk away quietly. She would fight this with everything she had. And I was right. Within days, she started telling everyone that the will was fake. She claimed that my dad had been pressured into signing it while he was sick, that I had manipulated him into cutting her and her sons out. She called family, friends, industry contacts, anyone who would listen, spinning the same sob story over and over again. First, some people believed her. She played the grieving widow perfectly, talking about how she had sacrificed so much for my father, and how it was cruel and unfair that he had left her with nothing. But it didn't take long for the truth to come out. People knew my dad. They knew what kind of man he was. And they knew Lisa. They had seen the way she treated him, the way she used him. They started questioning why she was making such a big deal about money when she had been married to a successful producer for years. And then came the real blow. One of my dad's close friends, someone high up in the industry, called her out publicly. He said that my dad had confided in him months before he died, telling him how Lisa had checked out of the marriage and how he wanted to make sure his real family was taken care of. Lisa's entire plan crumbled overnight. She had expected sympathy, support, people rallying around her. Instead, she got silence. Nobody wanted to be associated with her. And James and Jake? They had counted on my dad's money to carry them through their acting careers. But now no one wanted to work with them. They had made the mistake of siding with Lisa, and now that she had burned every bridge, they were going down with her. I should have felt bad. I should have felt something. But after everything they had done, I just felt relief. I thought it was over, that Lisa would cut her losses and walk away with what little dignity she had left, but I should have known better. She wasn't the type to accept defeat, and neither were her sons. The lawyer called me a few days later, saying he needed me back at the mansion for something important. I had no idea what it was about, but when I arrived I found Lisa and her kids already sitting in the living room, looking smug, like they had already won whatever battle they were trying to fight. Lisa barely looked at me, acting as if I wasn't even there, but James and Jake made sure to throw me a few glares. They were still clinging to the delusion that my father had somehow made a mistake, that they were the rightful heirs to his estate. The lawyer sat down, opened a file, and calmly placed a stack of papers on the coffee table. Then, with a voice so neutral it almost sounded bored, he said, "Before Theo passed, he made an additional clause in the will, one that only activates under specific conditions." Lisa scoffed, crossing her arms. "And what conditions would those be?" The lawyer didn't blink. "Your faithfulness." For the first time since I walked in, Lisa's entire body stiffened. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. The lawyer continued, explaining that my father had suspected Lisa of cheating on him long before he got sick. He had shared his concerns with his lawyer and, to protect his estate, had added a clause in the will. If evidence of Lisa's infidelity surfaced, she would lose even the 10% she had been given. At the time, Lisa had signed a document agreeing to this condition, thinking it was a meaningless formality. She never expected my father to actually collect proof. The lawyer reached into his briefcase and pulled out a USB drive. Without another word, he plugged it into his laptop and turned the screen toward us. What played next was undeniable. My father had secretly installed a CCTV camera in the living room long before he fell ill. The footage showed Lisa with another man, not just talking, not just flirting, but being intimate. Several different clips spanning months, each one removing any doubt that she had been cheating. I looked at Lisa, waiting for the explosion, but she was frozen, her face drained of all color. James and Jake, on the other hand, jumped up immediately, furious, demanding that the video was fake, that it was a setup, but the lawyer wasn't done. He pulled out printed photographs, ones taken outside hotels, restaurants, places my father never went but Lisa certainly did, with the same man in every shot. The evidence was overwhelming. It was indisputable. It was over. Lisa's shock lasted all of 5 seconds before she exploded. "This isn't fair. You can't do this. This was a private matter between me and Theo." But the lawyer was already shaking his head. "You signed the contract, Lisa. You agreed to the terms. By breaking your vows, you voided your right to any inheritance." That was the final nail in the coffin. Lisa, the woman who had been so sure she would walk away with my father's wealth, now had nothing. No estate, no money, not even the condo she had been given. The moment she stepped out of that house, she was officially homeless. She screamed at the lawyer, at me, at anyone who would listen, but it didn't change a thing. Her own arrogance had sealed her fate. I left soon after, feeling lighter than I had in weeks, thinking I had finally closed this awful chapter of my life. But Lisa wasn't finished. The next weekend, I went to visit my grandparents, leaving the mansion empty for a couple of days. When I came back, the front door was open. My stomach dropped. I hadn't left it unlocked. I hadn't given anyone permission to be inside. I immediately called the police, my hands shaking as I stood on the front steps, waiting for them to arrive. When they finally went in, they found exactly what I suspected. Lisa and her sons had broken in. They were in the middle of packing up valuables, acting as if the house still belonged to them. The moment she saw the cops, Lisa launched into hysterics, screaming that this was her home, that she had been tricked out of her inheritance, that my father had never meant to give everything to me. She went on and on, completely ignoring the fact that she had literally broken into my house. James and Jake stood behind her, trying to play innocent, but the police weren't having it. They arrested all three of them on the spot. Lisa kept screaming the entire time, calling me every name in the book, threatening to take me to court, saying I had stolen her life. But the moment the cuffs were on her wrists, reality finally seemed to hit. She wasn't going to talk her way out of this. As the police dragged her away, I just stood there, watching, feeling nothing but relief. The woman who had spent years using my father, disrespecting him, neglecting him in his last days, had finally lost everything. And James and Jake, the stepbrothers who had bullied me, who had treated my dad like an ATM instead of a parent, were right there with her. I knew they would try to fight this, to come after me in any way they could, but at the end of the day, the law was on my side. My father had made sure of it. I should have known Lisa wouldn't go quietly. Even after being caught red-handed breaking into my house, even after being publicly exposed as a cheater, even after losing everything my father had ever given her, she still wasn't done. Less than a week after her arrest, I got a call from my dad's lawyer. Lisa had officially filed a lawsuit against me, claiming that I had fraudulently manipulated my father into changing his will while he was sick and mentally unfit. According to her, I had coerced him into signing everything over to me, robbing her and her sons of their rightful inheritance. It was laughable. The lawyer assured me that she didn't have a case. The will had been drawn up long before my father's illness took its worst turn and had been signed in front of multiple witnesses. There was clear video evidence that he had been fully aware of what he was doing, that it had been his own decision to ensure Lisa got as little as possible. But Lisa wasn't relying on the legal system, she was relying on public opinion. Within days, she started spreading rumors. She went to every journalist, every industry contact, every producer who had ever worked with my dad and spun her sob story. She painted herself as the devoted wife who had been cruelly cut out of the will by a greedy, vengeful daughter. She cried about how she had given up everything for my father, how she had raised his child as her own, only to be betrayed. She made herself out to be a victim, saying she was now left destitute, while I lived in luxury, hoarding my father's fortune like some kind of villainous heiress. And for a moment, I panicked. I wasn't well connected in the industry. I was just a film student at the start of my career, while Lisa had been in Hollywood long enough to know all the right people. If she turned enough people against me, she could destroy my reputation before I even had a chance to build it. But then something amazing happened. Nobody believed her. The thing about Lisa was that she had spent years burning bridges without even realizing it. My father had introduced her to powerful people, but instead of building relationships, she had treated them like tools, only useful when they could give her something. Now that she was desperate, trying to call in favors, people were laughing her out of the room. Nobody wanted to be associated with her. And worse, people started calling her out. Some of my dad's old colleagues spoke up, saying that he had openly talked about how unhappy he was in his marriage and how he knew Lisa was just using him for money. One producer even leaked text messages from Lisa, where she had badmouthed my dad while he was still alive, complaining about how she was tired of dealing with his sickness and just wanted to move on. The final blow came when James and Jake turned on her. At first, they had been standing by her side, riding the wave of self-pity, hoping that somehow they'd still get something out of all of this. But when they realized that Lisa's public meltdown was making them untouchable in the industry, they jumped ship. James lost the acting gig my dad had secured for him because no production company wanted to be associated with the scandal. Jake had been in talks for a role, but after the rumors started flying, the offer disappeared. Suddenly, they were just as broke and ruined as their mother. And they hated her for it. One day, out of nowhere, I got a text from James. It was short, bitter, and to the point. "I hope you're happy. She ruined everything for us." That was the last I ever heard from either of them. I found out later that they cut ties with Lisa completely, moved out of the condo my father had left them, and were now struggling to find work. Whatever loyalty they had to their mother disappeared the moment she dragged them down with her. Lisa, once the glamorous, entitled Hollywood wife, was now completely alone. She had no money, no connections, no family left to manipulate. The lawsuit was dismissed within weeks, the judge barely even giving it a second look. And after that, she disappeared. No one in the industry wanted anything to do with her, and even the few acquaintances she had left quietly distanced themselves. For years, she had built her entire life around using my father. And now with him gone, with all her bridges burned, she had nothing. After everything, I stood in the middle of the mansion, the house that had once belonged to my father, the place where Lisa had ruled, where James and Jake had lived their entitled lives, where I had never truly belonged. And yet it was mine now. Every room, every piece of furniture, every echo of the past. But as I walked through it, I realized something. I didn't want it. This house had been the setting for so much pain, so many betrayals. My father had spent his final years feeling used and unloved here. I had never once felt like this was my home. It had always belonged to Lisa, to her sons, to the world my father had built around them. And now that they were gone, the walls still felt suffocating. So I made a decision. I called my grandparents, asked them to come over, and when they arrived, I handed them the deed to the mansion. At first, they refused, saying it was too much, that I should keep it, sell it, do whatever I wanted with it. But I told them the truth, I didn't want it. I wanted them to have it. My father had left them a share of his wealth because he trusted them, because they were the only real family I had ever had. And if anyone deserved a home filled with love, it was them. They hesitated at first, but eventually they accepted. My grandmother cried, hugging me tighter than she ever had before. My grandfather just nodded, squeezing my shoulder in a way that said everything he didn't need to put into words. They would take care of this place, turn it into something warm, something it had never been under Lisa's rule. And as for me, I was ready to leave it all behind. I had been offered a job overseas, a major film project that would set my career in motion, something I had always dreamed of. It was a chance to start over, to go somewhere new, far away from all the chaos, the lies, the lawsuits, the ghosts of my past. I took the offer. As I packed my bags, I heard bits and pieces about Lisa's final downfall. With no money, no home, and no support, she had tried one last time to crawl her way back into the industry, but no one wanted anything to do with her. Word had spread. She wasn't just a liar, she was a liability. The kind of person no one could trust. Even the people who had once tolerated her had turned their backs. She was completely alone. James and Jake had cut all ties with her. They had never been particularly loyal, and once she had dragged them down with her, they had no reason to stay. I heard they were struggling to find work, their names too attached to the scandal, their careers stalled before they even started. And me? I was done thinking about them. As my flight took off, I looked out the window and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. My father's story had ended, but mine was just beginning. I had spent so much time caught up in Lisa's mess, in the injustice of it all, and the weight of my father's choices. But now I was free. Lisa had spent her life using people, manipulating them, taking what she thought she deserved. In the end, it had left her with nothing. And I had spent years resenting my father for pushing me away, for choosing a family that never loved him. But in the end, he had seen the truth. He had made things right. And now it was time for me to move forward.